welcome again to our December session of BusinessWise Insiders, which is, of course, our final session of 2023. Before we get started, just a quick overview of what you can expect this morning. First, I'll walk everyone through the presentation, during which I'll keep everyone on mute just to minimize any disruptions. The presentation will last 20 or 25 minutes, and then I'll open it up to questions and discussion, so you'll have a chance to introduce yourself and ask or share anything that's on your mind about business development here at the end of 2023 and heading into 2024. You can always ask questions in the chat window during the presentation, and if we can't get to them in real time, we'll be sure to discuss them afterward. And I'll just echo Deb's sentiment. We really encourage everybody to stick around. The presentation will run through a series of ideas that we've covered over the past year, but really the bread and butter of Insiders, as you all know, is the discussion and exchange that we have afterward. It's really, I think, critical to building on the topics that we'll cover in the presentation, and it's great to just share ideas and build on what we've discussed. So this time last year, we decided to do something a little different for our final Insiders session of the year. Rather than drilling down into one specific topic, we're going to look back at a handful of ideas, strategies, trends that we've discussed in our various Insiders presentations over the course of the year, with the goal of highlighting some of the best business development ideas of 2023, and more importantly, of course, how you can use those ideas to create leads and appointments in 2024. So we'll be a little more casual and free-flowing than our usual Insider sessions, but it's a great opportunity to revisit some of the ideas that can have the biggest impact on our success in the coming year. But let's start by taking a step back and giving ourselves a little self-assessment. So think back to the beginning of 2023. Do you remember the goals that you set for yourself and your company? Would you say that you met them? And your goals, of course, aren't necessarily just about results. They can and should be as much about your process as they are about the outcome. So in addition to asking yourself, did I close X number of deals? Ask yourself, did I do the things that I committed to doing in 2023 to optimize my process for better outcomes? And along those same lines, what did you change about your approach in 2023 that worked and what didn't? And have those changes, successes, failures made you more or less confident in the process you're using heading into 2024? And so we're going to look through 4 ideas that I think will help us gear up for the next year. But before I do that, I just wanted to turn it back over to Deborah for any intro remarks on the presentation.
Go ahead, Sam. I think you've said it all.
Great. So let's just dive in. So I wanted to start our best of 2023 review with a topic that we covered way back in February, and that's how sales reps use the power of generosity to compel prospects to give them their time, attention, and business. So according to Dr. Robert Cialdini in his book, Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion, which we refer to often in our Insiders presentations, the principle of reciprocity holds that people feel obliged to give back to others what they have received. So in this example, the owl on the top offers to pay for lunch, and the owl on the bottom immediately feels the urge to return the favor. So even if the owl on the bottom would never have thought of doing a favor for his friend here, the offer triggers an internal obligation. And that's really the principle of reciprocity at its core. To show you how this works in the real world, one study showed that restaurant patrons tip more when their server brings a small gift at the end of the meal, for example, chocolates, along with the check. And even though the gift is small, it can really matter and create a sense of obligation on the part of the diner to give back in the form of a more generous tip. So this is showing how reciprocity really works at a subconscious level and can be really powerful even when the initial gift is quite small. And back in February, we looked at a couple key ways that B2B sales reps can use that idea of reciprocity to increase the odds that their prospect will say yes. So as in the previous example, we can use reciprocity to entice by giving something away first with the goal of creating a feeling of obligation. And we can also use it to transact, to give your prospect a reason to offer their time and attention in exchange for receiving something of value. But there's a third, even more powerful reason to be generous as a sales rep. And the key here is that real trust between a sales rep and a prospect can't be created by a gift that is or appears to be transactional. When you feel like you're being enticed as a prospect, or when you're offered a quid pro quo transaction from a sales rep, your immediate assumption is that the giver's ultimate goal is their own self-interest, which sort of calls into question their motivations and your ability to trust them. And in contrast, the sales giver creates trust by giving freely and expecting nothing in return. Their goal is not to have their prospect repay the favor. It's to prioritize their prospect's interests above everything else, because ultimately their prospect's interests are their interests. When you show a prospect that you can help them succeed, they'll want to work with you, and everybody wins. And while it's hard to provide specific examples of how this pure altruism generates sales success, there is evidence to suggest that it really matters. One survey you can see here at the bottom of the screen by the Rain Group in Boston found that over half of decision makers actively consider whether they feel like they're being sold to when deciding whether to connect with a seller. And the key takeaways here are that rather than giving to get something, the most successful sales rep's mindset is really give to give for giving's sake. And paradoxically, that mindset often pays the biggest dividends. And the value you offer, your unique knowledge and insights that you have that your prospect can't get anywhere else, creates something invaluable that your prospects will trust you and feel like they're not being sold to, that the relationship really is in their best interests. Transactional giving is ultimately a zero-sum game. You give something to get something else, while altruistic giving unlocks this sort of bottomless reservoir of trust and goodwill that comes back to you in the form of a repeatable cycle of sales, renewals, referrals, and new connections. So that was one idea I wanted to start with. That was an interesting take on why we give as sales reps, not just as a marketing gimmick or a way to give a prospect a reason to say yes to your offer, but that giving these days is a really critical piece of successful sales. Deb, did you have any thoughts on this piece?
I do. You know, years ago, in times of yore, like the 70s or the 80s, salespeople really controlled the information that a prospect could get. But today, prospects can access so much information online, not that all of it is accurate or truthful, they still can get it. So I think today it's really important to provide those insights or trustworthy information to gain the right kind of relationship with your prospects. And in addition to that, when you're thinking about what to give, I think it's important that what you're giving has value to the prospect. So if you're simply offering a free assessment of your prospect situation, you might want to think about the fact that you would, if your prospect called you tomorrow, you're not going to be charging them for that assessment. So how are you positioning the value of what you're giving? And I think all those things are important to consider.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like you said, several years ago, the flow of information was sort of less free, and sales reps had more control over what they shared with their prospects, feeling confident that they might not be able to get that anywhere else. And these days, information is everywhere, but paradoxically, your unique value really just comes from you. So it's a combination of being willing to give so that you can attract people's attention and time, just like anybody else, but also making sure, as Deb said, that what you give is uniquely valuable to your prospect, because that's what's going to set you apart in a landscape where information is so free-flowing and available. So now that we have the warm fuzzies from thinking about generosity in sales, I wanted to move on to our second big idea from 2023. And this will come as no surprise. We're pulling this from an insider session in the fall, where we examined whether generative AI tools can write B2B prospecting emails with the goal of determining whether it can help us as sales reps become more efficient and effective in our cold email outreach. And of course, the discussion about AI in sales, or pretty much anything these days, isn't going to just be limited to whether it can help us write. Lots of people will be talking and thinking about whether it can help us do pretty much everything in sales, from replacing certain jobs to something discrete like a specific sales outreach task. But we really wanted to focus on emails because this is clearly the most applicable and practicable tool right now. And AI obviously had a pretty big year in 2023, and we were curious whether it could help us write emails that meet these specific criteria needed for prospecting success. Number one, writing clearly. Number two, getting to the point. Number three, sounding human. And then number four, and most importantly, offering insights and value in exchange for an email reply. And AI actually did reasonably well for the first three. It was pretty good at writing clearly, pretty good at getting to the point, and it actually did a decent job of sounding like there was a human on the other end. But ultimately, those three won't really matter if there's no benefit to your prospect in the moment. We were evaluating whether AI could help us in our cold outreach to new prospects, and that's a point at which they're very likely not thinking about buying anything, and they may not even know they have a problem they need help with. And that means we shouldn't be looking to close any deals at that point of the initial cold email. Our singular goal is to start a conversation that leads to an appointment. And of course, as I just mentioned, in order to get your prospect to give us the answer we're looking for, we need to give them something in return. It's a transaction. So the slide here is, you can see the owl on the top saying, if I offer my prospect something that helps them address their problems and priorities, then the recipient will have a reason to reply, call, or click. And then here are just a few tips to ensure that your emails offer value to your prospect. First, it's not about you, it's about your prospect. So you should always frame your offer or request in terms of how your prospect stands to benefit from it. Second, again, think about the insights and ideas you can offer rather than the products or services you can offer. What do you know that your prospect doesn't? How can you help address their problems and priorities? And then finally, in the context of setting an appointment, these insights and ideas are free. You're giving them away, no strings attached. So what does your prospect get from a meeting with you, even if they never become a client, even if it never goes any further? So based on those general principles, here's the prompt that we fed to ChatGPT using a B2B lead generation firm, sort of like BusinessWise, as a fictional seller. So the priority here is to offer insights and value, as I mentioned, and the email should focus on the prospect's problems and priorities, provide a reason to meet, even if it never goes any further. And then here's what ChatGPT came up with. And this is a little bit wordy, but you see I've highlighted some sections here. The orange highlights are what I found to be sort of in the neighborhood of insightful or valuable, or at least hinting at something insightful and valuable. And honestly, there's really not much here in terms of any great insights or even the offer of insights in a future conversation. In contrast, the blue highlighted areas represent some pretty big problem areas. While the message starts out by highlighting the challenge the prospect might be facing, the email is really stuck in the seller's perspective. You can see all the instances of we and us throughout the message when the focus should be on you, the prospect. And then most glaringly here at the end, ChatGPT frames the meeting it's asking for as an opportunity for the sales rep, for the sender, to learn something from the prospect, rather than a chance for the prospect to learn from the seller, which is the exact opposite of what we're trying to achieve. Remember, we're trying to convey that we have insights and value that the prospect gets in exchange for agreeing to a meeting. So when it came to grading ChatGPT on this piece, we gave it an F. And it's an example that really shows why those unique human insights that Deb just talked about will continue to be a major difference maker for successful sales prospectors in the world of generative AI. So you can see we said ChatGPT highlighted the prospect challenge, but really stuck in the seller's perspective, didn't offer any new insights that were relevant to the prospect's problems and priorities, and then critically failed to give the prospect the reason to act. And then at the end of that insider session, we offered a few questions that we think we should all be thinking about as AI grows in popularity and sophistication. Some of them will get at your own experiences using generative AI and whether you think it helps, hurts, or makes no difference to what you're trying to achieve. And we can talk about that later in the breakout. And then here on the right side of the slide are some questions that encourage you to take a step back and look at your holistic approach to business development. Do you have a compelling offer and a focused list to provide the foundation for successful lead gen that we've been talking about throughout the year? And again, think about your own unique insights and ideas and how you can use them to give prospects the reason to engage and meet with you. The exercise that we ran through with ChatGPT showed only one small sliver of what generative AI tools can do. And it's clear that AI has both strengths and weaknesses. Like all technology, it has some real promise, but only in the hands of sales teams that have this strong business development process and foundation hinted at the right side of the slide that relies on providing value to the prospect in the form of that unique human insight and idea. Deb, anything to add here?
Well, I certainly agree with you, Sam, that AI is a tool like business-wise or a baseball bat or a violin that's totally dependent on the hands that are using that tool. And I think particularly with AI, we need to use it to help us save time, but not only that, because we have to use it with a critical eye. And when we do it together, like most technology, it can be a real positive change or it can be a disaster. So it's up to us to decide what the outcome is going to be.
Right. And I'm eager to hear what other people think about this in the breakout. You know, even since September when we ran this presentation, so much has changed in the world of AI. And obviously that will continue to be the case. I'm so interested to hear what everybody thinks. So next, we're going to switch gears and let's move from one of the newest tools that B2B sales reps have at their disposal, which is AI, to one of the oldest, which is the good old cold call. And while these two techniques obviously occupy very different ends of the spectrum, they are not unrelated. When the sales and prospecting landscape changes in any specific and meaningful way, as they have with email, social selling, AI, et cetera, that affects how we approach the task of new business development across the board. And if you don't update and adapt the ways that you use each prospecting channel, you're doomed to fall behind. So when it comes to cold calling, that includes taking a fresh look at the scripts you're using and being willing or even eager to find something new that can contribute to your success. So first, let's just take a quick look back at why you should still cold call in 2024, even in an ever-changing and increasingly tech-heavy B2B sales landscape. The first is that cold calling is direct. So unlike email and social selling, cold calling is what we call synchronous. You interact with your prospect in real time as opposed to asynchronous, where you send a message and then wait for your prospect to reply on his or her timetable and so on. The second, and this is critical given what we just talked about, cold calling is far more human than any other prospecting channel. And that allows sales reps to play to one of their biggest strengths, which is your interpersonal skills. And then third, cold calling builds confidence and combats fear. So successful sales is going to require human interactions, and often they will be uncomfortable ones. And if you limit yourself to the comfort of these asynchronous prospecting methods like email, you're never going to build the confidence that you need to offer honest advice that your prospects or clients may not want to hear, but need to hear. And then fourth, and most importantly, just like every other prospecting technique, it's true that cold calling is destined to fail if you're doing it the wrong way. But if you do it the right way, it can work just as well or better than other methods, especially in certain situations. So as far as scripts to consider, you're going to find countless recommendations online. And if you have any trusted sources you use for cold calling advice, I would always encourage you to check on them pretty regularly to see what ideas they have, anything new that you can add to your repertoire. In our insider session on cold call scripts from earlier this year, we looked at a few specific scripts that took new and different angles than we'd seen or tried before, and here are just a few of them. We always recommend coming up with a well-crafted and well-practiced voicemail script, since the vast majority of cold calls go to voicemail these days. And it's a great idea to combine voicemail with email to maximize the odds of a reply to either channel of outreach. And so here's one example of that approach that we came across earlier this year. And what's unique about this approach is that the sales rep explicitly states there's no need for a return phone call and mentions the subject line of the email that he's about to send. And then at the end, he mentions that he's going to call back next week if he hasn't heard back by then, which sets up another step in the cadence. And the thing I like about this is it's a very direct, explicit use of voicemail that is wholly geared toward getting a reply to that email and or setting up another step in the cadence. It's almost a given that he's not going to get a call back. So he's trying to use that to maximize his future steps in his outreach cadence. So if your voicemail script feels outdated or hasn't been working as well as you'd like, maybe take a shot with something like this, where you get really specific and aim to set up your next move. When you do get your prospect on the phone, we've always been proponents of permission-based openers, where you ask for the prospect's permission to sort of start the call. That's a professional and respectful way to begin a call, and the prospect, of course, is more likely to listen and engage when he or she has agreed to that conversation. And this script is an example of a permission-based opener from Jason Bay of the organization Outbound Squad, which is a sales coaching and consultation organization. What I like about this is that he starts from the premise that he's likely interrupting the prospect in the middle of something. So it's best to just be upfront about that fact. And then he's very explicit about his initial request. So he says, I know I'm probably catching you in the middle of something. Do you have 30 seconds for me to tell you why I'm calling? And then you can tell me if you want to keep chatting. It's a direct approach, and one that is probably pretty hard to say no to after you've answered the phone. And then it also sets up the very next step, which is for him to tell the reason for his call. So it's a great segue into the conversation. And then finally, here's another script that we came across this year, again, from Jason Bay of Outbound Squad. And this one's based on the idea that your prospect is almost certain to ask something along the lines of, so who are you with? Or what do you guys do? And it's a tough one because the temptation, of course, is to switch into features and benefits mode, where you're talking about your product or service in a way that won't really resonate with your prospect's problems or priorities. So to avoid talking about features and benefits, Jason encourages a who, what, how approach, where you talk about what you do through the lens of somebody else that you've helped. So when somebody asks, what do you guys do? You say, great question. A VP of sales I worked with at a company was facing X problem, and they wanted to achieve X goal. They used my help to install X solution, and then I'm curious, what are you doing to address that same problem? And with this approach, it's critical to end with a question to move the conversation forward. The question doesn't have to be the one that Jason suggests here. It can be more oriented toward setting an appointment. Something like, if that's on your radar, can we get 30 minutes on your calendar to look at how that approach might work for you guys? But again, identify your objectives and modify your script accordingly. So those are just obviously 3 of countless scripts that you could consider adding to your repertoire. We liked them because they took a slightly different approach on items that we try to achieve with our cold call scripts, but might be fresh and more successful. Deb, did you have any wise advice on how to look at cold call scripts in 2024 and anything specific about these 3 approaches?
I think it's important to choose your script, practice it with other people, get the feedback, refine it, and then use it. Don't wing it. There's no need to be winging a cold call script.
That's right. It actually reminds me of another piece of advice that Jason Bay offers, which is you don't practice your cold call scripts on your prospect. That's not professional. You practice them with your colleagues in role play, but get them down so that you're comfortable with them, and then deploy them with your prospects. It's both respectful and maximizes the odds of a successful outcome. All right, I know we're a little bit all over the place, but we're going to close today's session with our final big idea of 2023. And for that, I wanted to just take a look at a framework for handling prospect objections that might help you set more appointments in 2024. So with all of the approaches that we just talked about, of course, there's a pretty good chance and maybe a guarantee that your prospect will resist a little bit. It's part and parcel of B2B sales prospecting these days. So having a plan is really critical. And one idea that we looked at earlier this year was the distinction between a legitimate concern about buying your product or service and a knee-jerk brush-off objection that's really just an attempt at avoiding the conversation in the moment. Brush-offs are automatic. The prospect might not even know what they're objecting to yet. And a brush-off might take the form of something like, I can't talk right now, I'm heading into a meeting, or just send me an email, or sorry, not interested. They often sound a little bit like legitimate objections, but in reality, they're just avoidance tactics on the prospect's part. And with a brush-off, your goal should be to do whatever you can to pivot towards substance. And so one suggestion that I read this year that I thought was great was, especially on a cold call, try to frame your response as a time saver for a future conversation that they can avoid. So instead of saying, instead of sort of arguing with them about whether they might have time, you could say, I don't want to waste your time. So rather than calling you back later, let's just figure out whether this is even a priority for you and whether it would be worth it for you to hear some more ideas about how to address it. And then a second critical issue is recognizing that there's a difference between resistance over the phone and resistance over email, because each presents different challenges and opportunities. Resistance over the phone is pretty high pressure, but with the right strategy, it can be easier to turn it into a conversation because you're already in a conversation of sorts. You have your prospect on the phone, you're talking to them. So for example, when you try the tactic that I just mentioned, the prospect pretty much has to answer you because you've asked them a direct question, and there's a decent chance that they'll agree to talk for a few minutes right then and there. In contrast, it's much easier to ghost somebody completely over email because there's no actual human staring you in the face or talking to you over the phone. The flip side is that with email, you have an opportunity to show your prospect that there's a real live person on your end. So any kind of response from a prospect gives you the chance to start a one-on-one conversation, which is the ultimate goal of any email prospecting campaign. And as a bonus, asynchronous conversations like email are often the ones that are more likely to be resurrected at some future date than conversations start with a cold call. Often cold calls will be either yes or no right there, and then it never comes back. With an email, because it's asynchronous, because there's some sort of expectation for a future reply and back and forth, an email you sent days, weeks, or months ago can come back and present an opportunity to start a conversation. So really, as you approach objection handling, make sure you tailor your tactics to the outreach channel itself. And then here's a basic roadmap that you can try to think about to approach any type of objection, and that's embrace, inform, and ask. So the first point here, embrace, really gets at the fact that you shouldn't ignore or bulldoze your prospect's objection. That's just going to create sort of an adversarial, argumentative dynamic, when what you want to do is acknowledge that whatever prospect objection you hear, it's going to be legitimate in some shape or form. Show your prospect that you're listening by acknowledging the objection, and then use it as a pivot point. And what you're trying to pivot to is to informing your prospect. Show your prospect that you have insights and ideas into the challenges they face, and offering them value from a conversation with you, even if it never goes any further. And then finally, and really importantly, ask questions, because that's how to dig deeper into what your prospect cares about, and it's how you steer the conversation toward more friendly and more fruitful ground. And of course, the key here is to be able to deftly navigate this path, to use bridge statements that get you from embracing the objection to informing to asking, and it's really hard. But it's also really key to make a plan for navigating the objections you're almost certain to hear from your prospect, whether they're brush-offs or legitimate concerns, and whether they're on the phone or over email. Because the alternative is to be prepared only for the yes replies. And if that's your plan, then you're ignoring the reality of B2B prospecting, where prospect resistance is a fact of life. And you're ignoring opportunities to start conversations that lead to appointments and hopefully to close deals. So that was really the point I wanted to drive home, is that on top of the fact that objection handling is so key, there are a couple of critical distinctions that you can use to set up your plan. And then this embrace, inform, ask framework is a really great thing to think about and practice for each of the objections that you can expect from your prospects. Deb, did you want to add anything here before we wrap up the presentation?
I do agree totally, Sam, that when you get a not interested or we're all set right now response, whether it's in an email or in a conversation, that I see way too many people end the conversation there. And there's so much more to explore. And you have to go in small steps. Here's a person that you don't know, they don't trust you. And of course they're not interested, or of course they're set, because if they weren't, they'd be calling you or someone else. So you have to start building that rapport and gaining trust before you can move on to anything else.
Exactly. And really thinking a few moves ahead, or what sets the most successful successful sales reps apart from the competition. If you focus only on what you're saying and whether it sounds professional or competent, you're not really thinking about what your prospect's mindset is, what they're facing in terms of problems and priorities, and then what you can expect to hear back from them when they answer a cold call or cold email. So be prepared. Well, thank you again for attending the presentation. I'm just going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so we can get to the discussion portion of Insiders. So thanks again, everybody.